There is a silence that does not belong to the night. It does not drift in with the cooling air or settle gently over fields at dusk. It arrives like a verdict, sudden, absolute, engineered. And on October 14th, 1837, in the Carolina backcountry, that silence swallowed an entire plantation whole. 43 people vanished before morning. No blood in the yard, no splintered doors, no frantic horses. The supper table inside the main house was set for 9. Candles burned down into hardened pools of wax. A piano stood open as if the player had only just stepped away. But no one stepped back. You were never meant to study this story closely. It exists in fragments, county ledgers, witness statements, a sheriff's report that closes too quickly. The official record calls it escape, a word small enough to be comfortable, manageable, dismissible. But men don't coordinate 43 souls into darkness without leaving a scream behind, unless the scream was never meant to be heard. I want you to understand something before we go further. History is not just written by the victors, it is edited by the fearful. And when power is threatened, not by chaos, not by riot, but by disciplined intelligence, it does not react loudly. It erases. Harrow Hall was not the largest plantation in Carolina, not the richest, not the most brutal by reputation. That's what makes it dangerous. It was ordinary, stable, predictable, the kind of place that makes systems feel secure, and systems grow arrogant in security. You've been taught that enslaved men and women survived, endured, reacted, but what happened that night was not reaction. It was strategy. It was patience stretched across years. It was a quiet war fought with memory, timing, and absolute control over emotion. And here's the part that should grip you. The authorities stopped looking in 6 weeks. 43 human beings vanish in slave-holding Carolina, and the investigation closes quietly, politely, as if pursuing the truth would be inconvenient. Why? Because sometimes the most terrifying possibility is not that people ran, it's that they organized. And once you understand how organization undermines power, you begin to see patterns far beyond 1837. Stay with me. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It's a fracture in the story you were handed. And fractures, once seen, cannot be unseen. The night the pattern locked into place. The first mistake historians make is assuming the plan began that night. It didn't. It began years earlier. Plantations ran on routine, bells, ledgers, meal times, field assignments, patrol routes, every movement predictable. That predictability was meant to enforce control. But predictability cuts both ways. If you are forced to live inside a system long enough, you learn its rhythms better than the men who designed it. At Harrow Hall, the enslaved population had not changed significantly in 5 years. No major sales, no mass punishments, no outbreaks, stability. On paper, that meant contentment. In reality, it meant time. Time to observe which overseer drank too heavily on Saturdays. Time to note which patrol skipped the southern fence during heavy fog. Time to memorize the quartermaster's supply tallies. Time to map the woods not as wilderness, but as corridor. 43 people do not improvise disappearance, they synchronize it. And synchronization requires hierarchy, not the imposed hierarchy of the plantation, but an internal one. Quiet leadership, distributed roles, absolute discipline. Someone gathered intelligence, someone tracked provisions, someone identified sympathetic contacts beyond the property line. Someone calculated how long before absence would be noticed. Someone decided who would go and who would not. That last decision is the hardest truth. This was not panic, it was selection. The youngest child taken was 6, the oldest near 60. That tells you something. This was not a sprint northward in blind desperation. It was a calculated relocation of a community unit. Even the supper table in the main house fits the pattern. On October 14th, the owner had guests. That meant wine, distraction, extended evening activity. The house lights would burn later than usual. Noise would mask subtle movement. The enslaved quarters would not be checked as early. Cover. At some point between midnight and 2 in the morning, the pattern locked into place. No shouting, no visible struggle, no animals disturbed. By dawn, 43 lives had stepped beyond the boundary of ownership. And here is what unsettled investigators most. No one left behind evidence of haste. Tools were returned. Personal items were minimal. Storage bins were not ransacked, which means provisions had been moved gradually, over weeks, maybe months. A handful of dried corn here, a scrap of cured meat there, never enough to trigger suspicion. This was not an eruption, it was erosion. When the sheriff arrived 3 days later, he noted something strange in his report. No signs of distress or agitation appear among the remaining livestock. Think about that. Animals startle at chaos. There was none. Now ask yourself, how do 43 people move through rural Carolina terrain without detection? You don't, unless the terrain was never the destination. Stay with that thought. The geography was never the goal. When people hear 1837 and Carolina, they picture dense woods, swamp lowlands, and a desperate push north toward freedom. That assumption is exactly what would have protected the real plan. Because north was the obvious direction, and obvious directions are the first places you look. Harrow Hall sat within reach of river access that fed into larger trade routes. Not major ports, not bustling harbors, smaller crossings, timber landings, quiet transport arteries used for tar, cotton, and lumber. Places where movement was normal. Places where manifests could be adjusted. Investigators focused outward on forest searches, road patrols, neighboring plantations. They treated the disappearance like a jailbreak. But what if it wasn't a jailbreak? What if it was a transfer? The Carolina Low Country and Back Country in the 1830s were threaded with informal networks. Some were part of what we now call the Underground Railroad. Others were looser: church groups, free black communities, sailors, dock workers, indigenous trading paths that predated colonial maps. These networks were not myth, they were infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't appear overnight. It grows, quietly, invisibly, through trust and repetition. 43 people could not survive weeks wandering through open countryside without supply caches, safe shelter, and coordinated guidance. The math doesn't support it. Children slow movement, elders require care, food runs out. But what if survival in the wilderness was never the objective? Look at the river. Timber barges moved at dawn and dusk. Crews were small. Documentation was inconsistent. A sympathetic captain, or a coerced one, could conceal human cargo beneath tarps or within hold compartments used for freight. It sounds dramatic. It isn't. Trade routes were the highways of their time. And once you enter a river system, you stop being a group of fugitives on foot. You become traffic. Here's the detail that rarely gets discussed. No neighboring plantation reported receiving escapees. No nearby county recorded captures matching the group's size. Slave catchers found nothing, not a body, not a campfire site large enough for that many people. 43 people don't evaporate, they relocate. Which brings us to the question that forced authorities to quietly close the file. Who helped them? Because a coordinated movement of that scale requires outside cooperation, and outside cooperation means ideology. If free citizens, merchants, clergy, or sailors assisted, then the disappearance wasn't just an escape, it was a coalition. And coalitions are far more threatening than runaways. By week 4 of the investigation, language in the reports shifted. Less urgency, more vagueness. Phrases like probable dispersal and insufficient grounds for continued allocation of resources. Translation: this trail leads somewhere uncomfortable. Because if Harrow Hall's labor force had been strategically extracted through organized support networks, it would prove something Southern authorities could not afford to admit in 1837. The system had leaks, and not accidental ones.
The ledger entry. 3 days before the disappearance, an entry appears in the Harrow Hall household ledger that investigators never explained. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't circled in red ink. It was ordinary, which is precisely why it matters. October 11th, 1837. Inventory adjustment. Provisions accounted for in advance of seasonal transfer. Seasonal transfer. Those two words sit in cramped script between tallies of molasses and lamp oil. No elaboration, no follow-up notation. Now understand this. Plantations did conduct seasonal transfers, but typically of crops, equipment, sometimes livestock, not people. Human transfers were recorded explicitly. They involved bills of sale, contracts, or transport arrangements. 43 enslaved individuals did not simply shift locations without documentation. That would represent a major financial movement. Yet no sale record exists. No shipping manifest has been found. No creditor ledger reflects a transaction of that scale. So what was being accounted for in advance? Provisions, food stores, dry goods, salted meat quantities reduced slightly below projected winter use. Enough reduction to suggest pre-calculation, not theft. Pre-calculation. Here's what unsettled one later historian who studied the file. The handwriting in that entry differs slightly from the usual ledger hand. Subtle, a tighter slant, less flourish. Possibility 1, someone else wrote it. Possibility 2, the usual writer was under pressure. Possibility 3, the one no official document explores. Someone inside the household anticipated the disappearance and prepared for it. Now ask yourself, who inside a plantation household had access to ledgers? The owner, a family member, a trusted clerk, or occasionally an enslaved domestic servant tasked with transcription duties. We know from other documented plantations that literate enslaved individuals were sometimes used to assist with bookkeeping under supervision, rare but not unheard of. If someone within the enslaved community had limited access to records, they would understand supply cycles, shipment dates, credit dependencies, the financial fragility of the estate. That knowledge becomes leverage. Because here's the deeper implication. If provisions were adjusted in advance, then whoever made that entry knew resources would be needed elsewhere, not stolen in panic, allocated. And this is where the silence of the investigation grows louder. The sheriff's report references the ledger only once, noting minor inconsistencies in domestic account not deemed relevant to abscondment. Not deemed relevant. 43 people vanish, and an unexplained provision adjustment 3 days prior is irrelevant or inconvenient. Because if someone inside the house knew, then this was not merely an external network operation. It was infiltration. And infiltration suggests something far more destabilizing than escape. Collaboration across the boundary of ownership. Someone with access, someone positioned near authority, someone who believed in the plan or feared opposing it. That possibility is explosive in 1837 Carolina. It implies fractures within the very households that enforced slavery, and fractures inside a system are far more dangerous than pressure from outside it.
The 6-week silence. The investigation did not fail. It stopped. That distinction matters. 6 weeks after October 14, 1837, the county formally suspended active search efforts related to the Harrow Hall disappearance. The wording was clinical, dry, almost bored. Insufficient grounds for continued allocation of patrol resources. 43 enslaved people, legally categorized at the time as high-value property, vanish, and the county decides it isn't worth further pursuit? That defies economic logic, unless something else was happening. In late 1837, the South was not stable. The financial shock waves of the Panic of 1837 were still rippling outward. Banks were collapsing, credit systems were tightening, plantation debt structures were under strain. Labor was collateral. Human beings were tied to loans, mortgages, future crop projections. If word spread that a coordinated extraction of 43 enslaved individuals had succeeded, without bloodshed, without recapture, it would not just be a moral embarrassment, it would be a financial tremor. Because confidence is the spine of any system built on credit. And Harrow Hall's disappearance suggested something terrifying. Assets could organize. Assets could vanish. Assets could collaborate. If enslaved populations elsewhere began to believe that coordinated disappearance was possible, that external support networks could move entire groups undetected, you wouldn't see isolated runaways. You would see replication. And replication is contagion. Now consider another detail. In week 5 of the investigation, patrol logs decrease sharply. not because the trail went cold, but because patrol units were reassigned to regional stabilization duties. Stabilization of what? Crop security? Debt enforcement? Rumor control? The record does not say. But newspapers in nearby counties at the time mention heightened anxiety about agitational influences and external interference with Southern property structures. Notice the phrasing, not runaways, influence, interference. Language shifts when fear shifts. If local authorities suspected organized abolitionist coordination or internal collaboration between enslaved individuals and literate insiders, risking continuing a public investigation validated that fear. So the cleanest solution was administrative suffocation. Close the file, label it dispersal, reinforce patrols quietly, avoid spectacle. Because spectacle invites imitation, and imitation is what power fears most. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion. The disappearance of 43 people was not solved because solving it would require acknowledging that enslaved communities possessed logistical intelligence, strategic patience, and coalition-building capacity sophisticated enough to outmaneuver a plantation economy. That acknowledgement destabilizes the myth of helplessness. It reframes the narrative from passive suffering to active resistance structured with military precision. And institutions built on hierarchy cannot publicly validate that level of competence in the people they claim are incapable of self-governance. So Harrow Hall became a ghost, not because the people vanished, but because the truth did. 43 lives stepped beyond documentation. No graves, no chains, no auction records, no recapture notices. Just silence. But silence, as we began with, is not absence. It is control. And sometimes it is victory. What silence protects. Here is the part no archive can hold. If 43 people executed a coordinated disappearance in 1837, calculated, provisioned, externally supported, then Harrow Hall was not an anomaly. It was proof of concept. And proof spreads quietly. Think about the requirements. Long-term internal communication without exposure, agreed leadership without written record, gradual supply movement without detection, external rendezvous without betrayal, absolute emotional control on the night of execution. That is not chaos. That is governance under constraint. Now imagine that knowledge passing from plantation to plantation, not through pamphlets, but through memory. A hymn sung slightly differently, a coded prayer, a shared story of the 43 who walked at once. You do not need newspapers when you have oral tradition, and oral tradition leaves no paper trail for sheriffs to seize. This is what silence protects, not mystery, precedent. Because if Harrow Hall demonstrated that entire communities could relocate intact, elders, children, skilled laborers, then the power dynamic shifts subtly but permanently. The enslaved were not only labor, they were coordinated units waiting for alignment. The plantation system depended on fragmentation, separation of families, isolation of information, punishment of leadership. But Harrow Hall suggests those barriers were not impermeable. They were studied, mapped, tested, and then bypassed. There is one final detail buried deep in a secondary account written decades later by a regional historian. He mentions, almost offhandedly, that descendants of certain coastal free black families claimed origin stories involving a night crossing of unusual scale in the late 1830s. He does not elaborate. He does not connect it to Harrow Hall. But the timing aligns. The geography aligns, and oral histories often preserve what official records refuse to record. We may never recover their names. That is the cost of strategic disappearance. But perhaps that was the point. To survive, they had to become untraceable. To win, they had to become undocumented. History teaches us to look for chains breaking loudly, but sometimes power shifts when chains are simply set down, all at once, and the people who wore them step into darkness together. Harrow Hall was not burned, no revolt was recorded, no mass execution followed, just absence. And absence, when chosen deliberately, is one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance imaginable. 43 people did not evaporate. They exited a system that depended on their visibility. And in doing so, they left behind something more dangerous than rebellion. They left behind possibility. The record calls it unresolved, but perhaps it was resolved perfectly, just not for the men holding the ledger. The real precedents. Now that we've separated fiction from fact, let's look at what history actually records, because the documented record is no less powerful. Coordinated resistance did not need myth to be extraordinary. 1. Organized rebellion. Nat Turner in 1831. In Southampton County, Virginia, Turner and a small group of enslaved men organized a planned uprising that killed approximately 60 white residents. It was not spontaneous. It was deliberate, coordinated, and rooted in long-term communication and trust. The aftermath reshaped Southern law. Severe restrictions on literacy for enslaved people, heightened patrol systems, crackdowns on black religious gatherings. The rebellion terrified slaveholding states not just because of violence, but because it proved planning was possible. 2. Mass self-emancipation, the Great Escape of 1862. In May 1862, more than 500 enslaved people in Mississippi fled plantations simultaneously after Union naval forces approached. This wasn't chaos. Word spread strategically. Families moved together. Timing aligned with military shifts. Historians sometimes refer to these moments collectively as self-emancipation movements because enslaved people were not passively freed. They acted when conditions allowed. The Civil War saw tens of thousands leave plantations in coordinated waves once Union lines drew near. 3. The mechanics of the Underground Railroad. It was not a literal railroad. It was a decentralized network of free black communities, abolitionist clergy, sailors, dock workers, farmers, indigenous guides. Communication was coded, routes shifted, river systems were heavily used, so were port cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans. Contrary to popular imagery, many escapes did not involve solitary night travel through endless woods. Some involved forged papers, some involved maritime transport, some involved hiding in plain sight. And yes, entire family units sometimes moved together when coordination allowed. 4. Strategic intelligence was documented. Enslaved communities mapped patrol patterns, used religious meetings as cover for planning,
shared literacy secretly, leveraged river traffic, timed movement with economic disruptions. These are not speculative. These are recorded in diaries, abolitionist correspondence, military reports, and post-war testimony. 5. Why records are incomplete. Slaveholding states had incentives to minimize reports of organized resistance, avoid publishing large-scale successful escapes, frame coordinated departures as isolated incidents. Financial markets were tied to enslaved labor. Public confidence mattered. Panic could destabilize credit systems. This is not conspiracy theory. It is economic reality. What we learn from the real record. The fictional Harrow Hall scenario compressed many documented patterns into one dramatic event, but history shows resistance was often strategic, not impulsive. Coordination existed even under surveillance. Entire communities sometimes moved together. Power structures reacted by tightening control. The difference between fiction and reality is scale, documentation, and specificity, not capability. The people enslaved in the American South were not passive subjects in history. They were analysts of their environment. They were logisticians under constraint. They were network builders under threat. And when moments opened, war, economic crisis, geographic opportunity, they acted. If you'd like to continue, we can deep dive into a specific documented mass escape, analyze how river systems functioned in real escape routes, examine the economic panic of 1837 and its relationship to slavery, or explore how oral histories preserve resistance beyond written archives. The Silent Architects. Imagine the world of Harrow Hall not as a single plantation, but as a system of invisible gears, each enslaved person, each overseer, each house and field, a cog in a machine designed to enforce control. Yet within that machine, silent architects were quietly designing a counter-system, invisible to the masters, operating on intelligence, timing, and trust. Reuben, in our story, is not just a character, he is the embodiment of that truth, someone who observes, calculates, and anticipates. In the real world, enslaved people were often analysts. They knew patrol patterns, the weaknesses of fences, which doors creaked, which animals would alert a passerby. They cataloged every advantage and every risk. Their intelligence was honed over decades of living under a system that demanded awareness to survive. Every decision in these covert operations was a psychological battle. Who could be trusted? Who might betray the plan, either intentionally or through fear? Families had to be split in theory, reunited in practice. A mother might be asked to stay behind while her children went forward. A man might carry crucial knowledge in his head that, if lost, would doom everyone. And yet, the silent code of trust held firm, because these people had mastered something the slaveholders never understood, the power of patience and timing. Consider the metaphor of the river. To the untrained eye, it is just water, but to those plotting escape, it becomes a highway, a shield, a living map. Currents, depth, seasonal changes, and patrols along the banks are all variables in a living equation. Crossing too early or too late can mean death, and yet multiple crossings, planned in advance, can move an entire community safely, undetected, through a hostile landscape. Ward Driscoll, the overseer in our tale, represents the constant surveillance. In history, overseers and patrols were the human censors of this system, tasked with detecting movement, maintaining order, and quashing rebellion. But intelligence is not brute force, it is subtle, and the enslaved architects of escape knew that the key was not just avoiding detection, but shaping it,
misdirection, controlled routine, silence, and the illusion of compliance. It is in these layers of hidden awareness that the most profound truth of history lies. Power is never absolute. Even under the strictest systems, there are always gaps. There are always nodes of resistance. And those who learn to read the rhythms of control, like Reuben, like August, like the real men and women of history, can bend the shape of reality, orchestrating movements that seem impossible, yet are quietly inevitable. By the end of this journey, you will see that the true horror and the true genius of systems like Harrow Hall is that control can feel total, and yet beneath it, entire worlds of planning and resistance exist, invisible to those in power. The question now becomes how much of the history you accept is really the surface, and how much has been deliberately hidden from you.